What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the road was a piece of land nobody wanted? A swamp so thick with mud and cattails that the county had written it off the tax rolls twice. What if the last thing your teacher ever gave you wasn't money, or a letter of introduction, or even a kind word about your future, but a single, worn-handled draw knife and the belief that you could figure the rest out yourself? We've been sitting with that question for a while now, and we think you have too, in your own way. Because most of us have stood at some version of that crossroads, where the sensible path closed, and the only thing left open looked, to everyone watching, like a mistake. This is the story of Tessaly Vorn, and we promise you, by the end, you'll understand exactly why the people of Dunnock Hollow still talk about her. She was 22 years old when she arrived in Dunnock Hollow with $43, a canvas pack, and a draw knife wrapped in oilcloth that had belonged to her teacher, a woodshaper named Edwin Hale, who had died the previous November from a fever that took him in 4 days. Edwin hadn't been her father, or her uncle, or anyone connected to her by blood. He'd been the man who ran the cooperative on the edge of the town where Tessaly grew up, and when she was 13 and sleeping in doorways, he'd put her to work, sweeping sawdust, and told her she could stay in the storeroom as long as she kept her hands busy. She kept them busy for 9 years. By the time Edwin died, she could read a piece of white oak the way some people read a face. Every grain line a sentence, every hidden flaw a warning. Edwin had no children. His sister came from Pittsburgh and sold the cooperative inside of a week. The new owner had his own people. Tessaly understood. She packed what she owned, tucked the draw knife, Edwin's best one, the one he'd used since before she was born, into the bottom of her pack and started moving. She hadn't planned on Dunnock Hollow. She'd been heading further south, toward a larger town where there might be work in a furniture mill. But a wheel on the post wagon cracked outside of Dunnock, and while the driver spent an afternoon sourcing a replacement spoke, Tessaly walked the main street and saw a notice tacked to the door of the county land office. Tax parcel 7 Marsh, 11 acres, unclaimed, for sale to cover back taxes. Offer by sealed bid. She asked the land agent, a man named Cattails, what the parcel looked like. He didn't look up from his ledger. Bottomland, low and wet. Old mill race runs through the north end, but the mill's been gone 40 years. Soil's black muck for the first 2 feet, then clay. Nobody's farmed it since before the war and nobody's going to. What's the minimum bid? Now he looked up. He took in the canvas pack, the road dust on her boots, the fact that she was alone. $40, he said, and there was something in his tone that clearly meant you don't have $40. She did. Barely. She asked if she could walk the parcel before the bidding closed. Fales shrugged and gave her a hand-drawn map. She spent 2 hours out there in the afternoon light, moving through the cattails, reading the land the way Edwin had taught her to read wood. Not what it looked like, what it was. The mill race was still there, choked with vegetation but structurally sound, stone-lined, pulling water from the creek at the north end and carrying it south through the property. The soil along its banks was different from the muck of the low spots, darker, richer, and along the east edge, where the land rose slightly and the drainage was better, she found something that made her stop and crouch down for a long time. Black willow, swamp white oak, spice bush, and threading through all of it, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for, the long flexible shoots of basket willow. Salix viminalis, growing wild in dense thickets along the bank. Edwin had kept a bundle of it hanging in the cooperative. He'd called it the most useful plant in any wetland if you knew what to do with it. Tessaly knew what to do with it. She went back to the land office before it closed. She wrote $41 on a slip of paper, sealed it in an envelope, and pushed it through the slot. 3 days later, Cattails sent word to the boarding house, where she'd been sleeping on a cot in the washroom. She'd won the parcel. There had been no other bids. She heard the laughter before she got back to the land office to sign the papers. She didn't know then how word had traveled so fast in Dunnock Hollow. Later, she'd understand that Cattails had a habit of discussing county business with whoever happened to be standing at his counter, and that whoever happened to be standing there that morning was Aldous Pemberton, who owned the feed store and the lumber yard and 3 of the 4 most profitable farms in the valley. Pemberton was a man who liked to know everything that happened in Dunnock before it happened to him. When Tessaly came out of the land office with her signed deed, Pemberton was standing in the street with 2 of his farmhands. He looked at the paper in her hand, and then at her, and then he smiled the way a man smiles when he's not actually amused. "You're the one that bought the marsh," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. What do you intend to do with it?" "Work it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to his farmhands. Work it, he repeated, and the three of them laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but in the easy, dismissive way of men who have decided something is beneath further consideration. That land floods in February, Pemberton said. Floods in March. Floods in April if we get a wet spring, which we usually do. Whatever you put in the ground drowns. Whatever you build sinks. There's a reason no one's touched that parcel in 40 years, girl. The land itself doesn't want to be worked. Tessaly folded her deed and put it in her coat. Thank you for the advice, she said, and walked past him. She heard him say something to his men as she went. She didn't catch all of it. She caught foolish and waste, and by June she'll be gone. She kept walking. The first 3 weeks were the hardest. There was a structure on the property, barely. An old storage shed built from chestnut planks, its roof long since collapsed, its floor the same black muck as everything else. She cleared what she could, salvaged the planks that hadn't rotted through, and rigged a canvas tarp over the 4 walls that still stood. It wasn't a house, it was barely shelter, but it kept the rain off, and that was enough for now. She slept on a pallet of dried cattail leaves with her pack under her head, and Edwin's draw knife laid beside her, wrapped in oilcloth, the way she'd always kept it. The first night, a fox came and sat at the opening of her canvas door and looked at her for a long time before it left. She wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not. She decided it was. Every morning she woke before light and spent an hour simply walking the property, watching the water. Where it moved, where it pooled, where it drained fastest. Edwin had told her once that the best craftsmen she'd never meet were the old mill builders, that they could look at a piece of flowing water and see, before a single stone was laid, exactly what it wanted to do and what you'd have to give it to make it cooperative. Tessaly wasn't a mill builder, but she understood the principle. You worked with the nature of your material, not against it. The mill's race was her material. She spent the second week clearing it. It took all day, every day, pulling decades of accumulated mud and root matter from the stone channel by hand, hauling it in a borrowed wheelbarrow to the low spots along the field edge, where it would dry and eventually become something useful. The work was exhausting in a way that went past muscle and into bone. She came back to her canvas shelter each evening, barely able to lift her arms, ate whatever she had, usually cornbread and dried beans. She cooked over a small fire, and fell asleep so quickly she sometimes woke hours later with her spoon still in her hand. The only person in Dunnock who talked to her during those weeks was a woman named Flossie Gale, who ran a small laundry on the east end of Main Street and came out to walk the road past Tessaly's property every evening before supper. Flossie was 50-something and wide-shouldered and had the particular quality of not saying much but meaning all of it. The first time she stopped at the fence line, she looked at what Tessaly had done with the mill race and said, "You cleared 6 feet of that thing today." "Closer to 8, Tessaly said. "Alone? There's only me." Flossie looked at the canvas shelter. She looked at Tessaly's hands, which by then were cracked and mud-darkened in the creases. She said, "I make soup on Tuesdays. I always make too much." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked on. On Tuesday, she came by with a covered pot and left it at the fence post without knocking. Tessaly found it when she came in from the field. She stood there for a moment, holding a warm pot of potato soup, alone in the early dark, and felt something she hadn't felt since Edwin died. The specific, hard-to-name sensation of being seen. By the 4th week, the mill race ran clear. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where water suddenly surged through like in a storybook. It was gradual, a trickle becoming a flow, becoming a quiet, steady pull of creek water through clean stone tunnel channels, the way it had run 100 years ago when someone had built it for exactly this purpose. Tessaly stood at the south end on a Tuesday morning in late spring and watched the water come through and felt something settle in her chest. Now she could begin. She'd been harvesting the basket willow since the 2nd week, cutting the long shoots in the early morning and laying them in bundles to soak in the mill race itself. The moving water kept them supple and prevented mold. Edwin had taught her basketry not as a hobby, but as a system. The draw knife was for splitting and shaving the thicker stems into weavers. Her hands were for the rest. She'd made her first basket at 14, her 100th by 16, and by the time she left Edwin's cooperage, she could work fast enough to make something worth selling in an afternoon's sitting. She set up her working space under the largest of the swamp white oaks at the east edge of the property, where the ground was firm and the light came through clean in the mornings. She built a simple workbench from the salvaged chestnut planks, rigged a soaking trough from sections of the old mill race stone, and began. The first baskets she made in Dunnock were plain market baskets, nothing elaborate. She walked them into town that first Saturday morning and set them on a blanket near the church, the way she'd seen vendors do in other towns. She sold 4 before noon. The 5th, a deep oval with double-wrapped handles, a woman held for a long time, turning it over, pressing the weave. "Where'd you learn this?" the woman asked. "From a man named Edwin Hale," Tessaly said. "He's gone now." The woman bought it, told her neighbor. The neighbor came back after church. By the time Tessaly packed up that afternoon, she'd sold 11 baskets and taken orders for 3 more. She didn't tell anyone the baskets came from her marshland. Let them wonder, for now. It was Aldous Pemberton who came to her property that June. She was working at her bench when she heard him at the gate. The heavy, deliberate tread of a man who doesn't second-guess his right to go where he pleases. He stood at the fence line and looked at the mill race, which was running clear, and at the willow thickets, which she'd managed into productive rows, and at the workbench under the oak, where a dozen baskets in various stages of completion hung drying on pegs. He didn't say hello. He said, "I hear you've been selling at market." "I have. Baskets." He said the word like he was deciding whether to be insulted by it. Among other things, she'd branched out by then: eel traps for the fishing families on the creek, storage cradles for root cellars, a custom drying rack for Flossie Gale's laundry that had led to 2 orders from other laundry women in town. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mill race again. Then he said, almost despite himself, "You got that running." "In March." Another pause. "I'll give you $80 for the parcel," he said. "You paid 41. Call it double your money in 4 months. Tessaly set down her draw knife. She looked at Aldous Pemberton, at his good coat, at the calculation behind his eyes, at the way he was standing at the fence line rather than coming in, as if the property might still be beneath him, but the situation had changed enough to warrant a visit. "No," she said. 100. "No." Something moved through his expression, not anger, something harder to read. "The flooding in February," he started. "I've dug 6 drainage channels along the west border," she said. "The standing water clears in 4 days now, not 4 weeks. I've got raised beds going in along the east side. The willow root system is stabilizing the soft ground faster than I expected. By next spring, this will be productive farmable land." She paused. "But I won't be farming it. I'll be working it the way I know how." He stared at her for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "people in this town think you're peculiar. People in this town laughed at me in the street in March," she said. "I remember." He left without another word. She picked up her draw knife and went back to work. That evening, she sat outside her canvas shelter, which by then had been replaced by 3 walls of salvaged chestnut plank and a proper shingled roof section, courtesy of material she traded 24 baskets to a local builder for, and looked at what 4 months had made of 11 acres of worthless marsh. The mill race ran in the last light. The willow rose bent slightly in the evening wind. Somewhere in the cattails, a red-winged blackbird was making its opinion known about something. She thought about Edwin, about the draw knife lying on her workbench, about how he'd told her once, on a slow afternoon in the cooperage, that the best wood was never the straightest wood. It was the wood that had learned how to grow around whatever tried to stop it. She thought he'd been talking about trees. We should tell you what happened in August, because it's the part of this story that most people in Dunnox still talk about. There was a family, the Rudds, who farmed the land adjacent to Tessaly's north boundary. Hector Rudd and his wife Constance, and their 3 children, the youngest being 4 years old. They'd been in Dunnock long enough that people considered them fixtures, and they were the kind of family that everyone in a small town knows. Not prosperous, not troubled, just steady, present, part of the fabric. In August, the youngest Rudd child, the 4-year-old, a girl named Livy, came down with something that the doctor in Dunnock, a man named Prescott Angle, who was capable but limited in his resources, described as a severe respiratory fever. The kind that settled into the lungs and wouldn't let go. Dr. Angle had his medicines. He used them. Livy Rudd got worse. Constance Rudd came to Tessaly's fence on a Wednesday morning, and Tessaly could see from 50 yards that something was badly wrong. Constance wasn't the kind of woman who asked for things easily. She stood at the gate with her hands clasped in front of her and said, "I've heard you know plants, that you know what grows down by your water." She stopped. Started again. "My daughter is very sick. Dr. Angle says there's nothing more he can do." Her voice was level in the way of someone who has already used up all their other voices. I don't know what I thought. I'm sorry to bother you." Tessaly was already setting down her work. She walked the property with Constance, not talking much, gathering as she went. Horehound from the bank above the mill race, She'd found it growing there in May and left it deliberately, knowing its use. Elderflower, dried from bundles she'd hung in the storage shed back in June. Spicebush bark, which grew along the south edge. Flossie Gale had told her once, back in April, about her grandmother's use of it for chest illness. Tessaly had listened, as she listened to everything, and filed it away. She made up a bundle and wrote out careful instructions on a scrap of brown paper, the best she could, the way Edwin had made her write out the steps for a new technique until she could do it without thinking. She told Constance to talk to Dr. Angle before using any of it. She wasn't a doctor. She was a basket maker who knew plants. And she pressed Constance's hands around the bundle. Constance Rudd walked home without speaking. Tessaly went back to her bench. She didn't sleep well that week. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done, and she didn't check in at the Rudd farm, because she knew that hope imposed on a family in crisis is its own kind of cruelty. On the Sunday of the following week, Hector Rudd came to her gate with his hat in his hands. He said, "She's better." He said it very quietly, the way men in that era said things they didn't have words big enough for. "The doctor says whatever you sent helped turn it. He wants to know what was in the bundle." Tessaly told him. She wrote it down so Hector could take it back to Dr. Angle. She also told him, and this mattered, that every plant in that bundle grew wild on her 11 acres of useless marsh, and that she'd been leaving them alone on purpose, because they had use if you knew what to look for. By the first week of September, Dr. Prescott Angle had come to walk her property himself, a notebook in hand. He was 60 years old, and had practiced medicine in rural communities his entire adult life, and he had the quality, rarer than it should be in anyone, rarer still in men of his era and station, of genuine curiosity about things he didn't know. He spent 3 hours on her land. He asked careful questions and wrote down her answers in small, precise handwriting. Before he left, he stood at the mill race for a moment and said, "Miss Vorn, you have a pharmacy growing here, a modest one. But real, I know," she said. "I knew in May." He looked at her. "Why didn't you say anything?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because in March, every person in this town had already decided what this land was worth," she said. "I needed to know it first, before I could explain it to anyone else." Dr. Angle nodded slowly. He put the notebook in his coat. He said, "I'll be sending people to you if that's acceptable. For the whorehound in particular, come winter." "That's acceptable," she said. "We want to be honest with you about something. The town of Dunnock Hollow didn't transform overnight. Aldous Pemberton didn't come back and apologize. The people who'd laughed on that street in March didn't organize a ceremony. That's not how towns work, and it's not how people work either. What happened was quieter, and in some ways, more lasting. Flossie Gale started sending her laundry customers to Tessaly for storage baskets. Hector Rudd spent a Saturday helping her reshingle the last section of her roof, and brought his eldest son, who was 15 and curious about the willow work. 3 other families along the valley came to walk the marshland that fall. Once word had moved through the community the way word does in small places. Not all at once, but in increments, person to person, each one carrying one piece of a larger story. Cutter Fales, the land agent, stopped her on Main Street one October afternoon and said, without quite looking at her, "I heard about the Rudd girl." He paused. That was a good thing. It was not an apology for his tone the previous March, but it was something. And Aldous Pemberton. Pemberton came back in November. He stood at her gate again, and this time she noticed he'd left his farmhands back at the road. He said, "I want to buy basket willow cuttings. For the wet corner of my east field. I've been trying to stabilize that bank for 10 years. Tessaly looked at him for a moment. "Cuttings are 50 cents a bundle," she said. "I'll tell you how to plant them. That'll cost you $1. He reached into his coat for his money. She didn't smile at him. She wasn't that kind of story, and she knew it. But she made the transaction simple and professional and equal, the way Edwin had always handled the men who came into his cooperage with their assumptions intact and left with the barrel they needed. You didn't humiliate people. You just didn't let them forget, either. By the following spring, her second spring on the land, Tessaly Vorn had rebuilt the storage shed into a working structure with a proper floor and a dedicated soaking room for the willow. She had 2 women from town who came 3 mornings a week to help with production, paid fairly, work they'd asked for. She had a standing order with a dry goods merchant in the county seat for market baskets, 12 dozen per season. She had a kitchen garden on the raised beds she'd built along the east edge, and she had the marsh itself, still wet, still muddy, still flooding in February and draining in March, doing exactly what it had always done, which was exactly what she needed it to do. The draw knife lived on a hook above her workbench. She used it every day. She kept the blade oiled and the handles wrapped the way Edwin had shown her. And sometimes in the early morning, when the light came in at the right angle and the mill race was audible through the open door, and the property smelled like wet stone and fresh cut willow, she felt something that she couldn't have named at 22 but recognized more clearly now. That the land was hers, not because she'd paid $41 for it, but because she'd listened to it until she understood what it was. That's what Edwin had actually given her, she thought. Not the draw knife. The draw knife was just a draw knife. What he'd given her was the habit of listening to materials until they told you what they could become. She'd done that with the marsh. She was still doing it. We've told you Tessaly's story because we believe in it. Not as a fairy tale, and not as an instruction manual, but as the kind of thing that actually happens when someone decides to look at what everyone else has turned their back on and ask a different question. Not, what's wrong with this? But, what does this know how to do? There are things in your life, maybe a skill you've set aside, maybe a piece of ground that looks wrong from the outside, maybe a kind of work that doesn't fit the usual description of valuable, that are waiting for someone to ask that second question. We'd love to know, if you were standing at Tessaly's fence in March, looking at 11 acres of black mud and cattails, what would you have seen? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. And if you want more stories from people who looked at the forgotten thing and found what was hidden there, well, you know where to find us.